Tom Miller is CEO of Small Batch Standard. Tom's out of Nashville. Through the side door of experience is how Tom describes his entry into the craft beverage universe. With an eclectic mix of systems engineering, manufacturing, marketing, consulting, and operations background, Tom brings a unique outsider's perspective. Woo!
Well done.
Let's welcome Tom.
All right, thanks everybody. I want to kick off with a quick poll. Who here would prefer to be making more money if you had the choice? Okay, me too. Just want to make sure we're on the same page because we're going to talk about that today. So let's put the business owner hat on. We got a slight update to our title. This is a little bit more forward-looking. We want to focus on 2024. And what we're going to talk about is really the answer to this question. And so I kind of mean that in two ways, like where is the profit that we might have expected to have made over the past couple of years? Why hasn't it shown up? And then looking ahead to 2024, where can we go to find additional profit if we're looking to improve? So, Small Batch is really this group of people. I'm just the guy here presenting their work today. And our mission is to help craft breweries grow profits. So everything on the back office, take it off the plate. And then really our goal is just to make better business decisions based on that information. And these folks are doing it every day. So a lot of the content you'll see here is the culmination of their work. So again, I'm just the messenger. Okay, so gonna rewind the clock a little bit. I'm going to tell you some stuff that you already know, but I'm going to tell it to you because I think it matters to establish why we're encountering so many challenges right now in terms of business decision making. So 2015, this is kind of the big bang period where really the main takeaway is like more demand for beer than supply. And so that meant that basically anybody with a brain at this point in time who was dedicated to brewing beer, set up a location, put brewery across the top, and it's like you'd sell your beer. The other thing that was happening during this period was all of your customers were asking for more beer, distributors were asking for more beer. So with that equation, it's like, okay, what's the path to growth for the brewery? Increase capacity, we're gonna sell through. Increase capacity, we're gonna sell through. So expansion, additional equipment, hiring ahead. These were kind of like the business strategies that worked really, really well during this period of time. And I think the kind of fast forward to where we're at today, some of the things that we're encountering, and this is the type of stuff that we talk to folks about all the time, is that we're a little bit stuck in that 2015 mindset of how to solve the problems that we're encountering. So if we're not generating enough profit, we're going to additional sales channels and trying to increase. We're trying to increase capacity so we can outsell the overhead that we have in the business. The problem is it's a lot more challenging. There are a lot more variables that have changed since that previous period. And the reason they've changed is a couple of things. Number one is just like the market is saturated, and that happens with every new market opportunity. So if there's more people supplying beer, then there's less demand, which means that kind of prices stabilize. So you're not able to charge quite as much. There's a little bit of downward pricing pressure. But then, we've had all the inflationary things that have happened. Costs have gone up, wages have gone up, and that's really the effect of both that increase in the amount of breweries, increase in competition. Then we had this COVID thing, and it was like, okay, we're all out of business, but then all of a sudden we have all this government money. So that kind of like threw a weird period. It's like we weren't even operating the business in a normal environment. And so that kind of like set that aside. And then it's like 2022, 2023, we kind of got back to business, so to speak. But now all the conditions have changed, and all of these challenges have entered into the picture from those increased costs and the plateauing effect. So our perception of what the problem is with this is not necessarily that happened, because in any market, you're going to have that occur over time. But I think the issue is we have been slow to catch up with the change in business decision making based on that information. And so it's like the answer to decreased sales isn't always to sell more. And the answer to how do we expand is not always just to build more capacity, increase distribution. And that's where my pontification about the market ends. Because really what we focus on is not necessarily like big economic trends. Like those are things that we have to deal with from a business owner's perspective, but it doesn't really help us in the day-to-day. We got to figure out what do we do with that information, and then how do we move the business forward in a productive way. So the rest of this presentation is an example, an exercise, a hypothetical brewery that we built so we could talk through the numbers. So our friends at Downtrend Beer Co., appropriately named, they've been on a little bit of a downtrend. And so we'll talk through kind of what's going on within this brewery and use it to introduce an alternative way of looking at the business. So these are their numbers. This is a rolling 12 revenue and profit chart, which basically means we're just taking the annualized number for all of the different categories that you see here. Their revenue in green at the top, they rode the wave. So increased production, initial location, started distributing, opened a second location, increase, and then, okay, we got 2 locations, we got, a good distribution setup. And from 2016 to 2020, these folks were raking in some serious profit. They were taking advantage of the fact that our red line here, their overall expenditures for the company outside of materials used for the beer, pretty stable, slowly increasing, but revenue is just like way outpacing. So that initial core team and set of expenses, overhead, rent, utilities, all that stuff was relatively fixed, slowly increasing, but that revenue spike outpaced that pretty quickly. And then in gray, you have cost of goods sold, which is pretty much matching that increase in revenue, but because primarily taproom focus, and then also in the early stages of distribution, like much better pricing, that gap between cost and revenue is pretty high. So those contributing factors are like this business that has operated through this period of time did really, really well. Then we have the COVID dip. And then on the other side of the COVID dip is, okay, a recovery, but not up to where we were at before, which I think is pretty representative of what has happened to most folks. And so you can see, like, with that recovery, they're still making enough profit, but over time, the increase in expenses in red, combined with like the slow creeping up of costs of goods sold for the materials and packaging going to the products, now they're kind of creeping down in this break-even territory, maybe a little bit of a loss for 2023. And so, painting that picture to illustrate a scenario that we're encountering a lot, which is the business was doing really well before, the business is not doing as well today. What has changed and what can we do about it? And so this is kind of what that chart looks like broken down for 2023, which if you think about your financials from last year, this is what this business is looking at. They're predominantly taproom sales, 2.8 million, which is incredible for a 2-location taproom operation. Their wholesale, they're about 1.8 total. Most of that is going through cans, a little bit through draft. Cost of goods sold, 1.4 million. They've got some advertising spend. The majority of their other expenses are in payroll and this other category, which is all the other stuff that you have to spend on to run your brewery. Then we got rent, supplies and materials, utilities. All that adds up to is like slight loss. And it's a little bit of a shame because there's a lot of work that went into producing this revenue and the setup for all of the costs and running the operation. So now it's ask the audience time. What suggestions would you have for this business to start focusing on to improve their financial picture. Any thoughts?
How much debt are they carrying?
Not much.
So they're almost out of woods there.
Yep.
When I was in business school and doing case studies, the first step anybody would do is they lay everybody off.
Lay everybody off. Okay.
Cut payroll.
I would start looking for
I didn't
areas
agree
of
with it.
decreased spending.
Okay. Decrease spending. Good.
What's the other? I mean, I would look at what the other is too. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd pick the two highest numbers and figure out what's going on.
Great.
Focus on the area with the greatest potential for revenue growth, which looks like taproom sales,
Great.
probably programming.
I love it. Thank you. Okay. So I think the combination of answers that you all gave is actually it's not going to fall necessarily into the category. I'm going to give you the out that it's not going to fall into the category of the old playbook. You all actually had some pretty good suggestions, but what we are seeing in terms of decision making, in terms of what to do in a situation like this, is kind of a grab bag of suggestions. And all the things up on the screen right now are not bad things to do. These are all things that can be productive for the progress of the business when applied in the right context. The problem is, in the 2015 era, you could essentially do pretty much any of these things at any point in time and make it work. The problem now is, okay, our parameters are much tighter, and so we have to focus, we have to do the 80-20. We have to look specifically at what are the opportunities that we need to pursue in order to make progress, because a lot of these things, if we were to just pursue them, they would be counterproductive. And that's what got us to this point, and so if we need to change, then we need to do something different. And so that's what we as a team have spent a lot of time on the last couple of years, is asking sort of like, what is an improved framework that we could look at the business through in order to make more productive decisions about what to do next. And so one thing that we have been talking about for a while is like essentially a brewery is many businesses under one roof. So it's light operations, it's retail, it's distribution. But another thought that we kept coming across was that essentially the treatment of the distribution business, the taproom business, the other aspects, the other sales channels, it's almost like entirely separate conversations about how to manage each kind of division of the company. And so what we came up with was essentially the big three business units is what we call them. Taproom, distribution, and contract. We've got some folks doing D2C, which was really like a COVID thing, but a minority of people are doing that successfully. And the idea is that there is a different treatment for these different revenue streams based on where they're coming from. So the strategy in retail is very different than the distribution strategy, but it's not just the strategy, it's also the financials of the company behave very differently across those different units. And so the updated methodology that we've put into place is essentially taking all the costs in the company, putting it into one bucket. We've got all of our revenue sources, we've got our cost of goods sold assigned to those revenue sources, but then we got all the other expenses, and we're taking those and we're bucketing them and assigning them to each of those revenue streams. And so this is how we do it. Separate out revenue. We're also going to look at barrels sold through each of the channels. Assign a cost of goods sold to each for each product sold, and then that rolls up to cost for each of the business units. And then step 3 is really where we're going in the back end and we're splitting things out. So we're going to take payroll and rent and all the other expense categories and then divide those up according to what we think makes the most sense of where those costs are needed. So for example, if we have the production team and the cost of their labor that's going to be most closely related to basically the volume of beer produced. And so if we take the number of barrels sold in tap room versus distribution, then we can assign production labor to tap room, production labor to distribution, and get an idea going through those different expense categories of where those costs are really going so that we can have a better understanding of how individually each of these business units are doing. And there are other ways of doing it besides barrels, but to keep it simple, we'll kind of just look at that for the time being. And so in this example, just pulling kind of a random month from 2023 for this business, let's say they did 128 barrels out of the tap room, 257 in distribution, 385 total. That works out to a third, 2/3 in terms of percentage basis. And so if we come across an expense category that is very straightforward, tap room supplies, we're not messing with that. We're just putting it directly to the tap room. That's pretty straightforward. Then we have the production labor example, which I just mentioned, which we're just multiplying that 35,000 number by the percentage basis for each of the channels. And so we have 11.6 going to tap room, 23.4 going to distribution. And so that's kind of that's the exercise. But we're a team of accountants, but we hate just doing accounting for the sake of doing accounting. We want to figure out how do we use this information to problem solve and take what we're doing to kind of split up those different business units and use it as a problem solving tool to zero in on what are the best opportunities for decreasing costs, increasing sales, so on and so forth. Okay, so now let's apply that to this downtrend overall P&L, which is running about negative 0.5% loss. And so doing the initial split, tap room versus distribution, we've already got those sales allocated appropriately. So we're just taking tap room sales, putting them over here. Distribution, we'll put them over there. And so going to the next step for the tap room, cost of goods sold, about $460,000. And so you can kind of see right off the bat, and all of you are experiencing this, is margins in the tap room are way better. And so it's pretty incredible that for this business, even though they're overall breaking even, in the tap room, the actual cost to produce the beer, apart from labor and other expenses, is very low. So we're making 2.8, we're keeping 2.3, which is pretty great. We're allocating all the advertising towards tap room. We're spending that on marketing. Payroll expenses, about $550 assigned to the tap room. That's a combination of production labor, administrative, front of house, back of house, all combined. About $280 in rent, $120 in utilities, $650 in this miscellaneous other category. And so when we add it all up, this is kind of our first interesting insight, which is allocating the cost in this way, we actually get $550,000 in profit from the taproom side of the business, which is about a plus 20%. Our benchmark ranges for best performing taprooms that we see is about 12 to 18%. And so in this particular case, they're outperforming that benchmark. They're doing an incredible job. Now, I think you can kind of see what's coming on the other side. Cost of goods sold in distribution is much higher. We know distribution margins are lower. And so out of that 1.8 million, they're keeping about $850K. Then when we go to allocate the remainder of those expenses, this is where the problem area shows itself, which is we've got about 550 in payroll going to distribution. We've got less rent because we're just doing it out of our production space versus the two retail spaces, but still some rent applied towards that. Utilities, other. And so overall, their distribution business is running at a 570K negative, so negative 31%. Just going to pause here for a second, and this is kind of the difference in perspective that we are finding very useful. which is like initially looking at the aggregate performance of the company, we're seeing about break even, but like, okay, like we're not going out of business. And so kind of like the mindset from a business owner's perspective in a scenario like that is like, okay, we got to make a few tweaks. Like if we just tune this up here, adjust this down there, we can get back to profitability and start to increase again. When we're splitting it up like this, it's like, holy crap, we're doing amazing in the tap room. But oh my God, we're in trouble in distribution. And this is not always the case. We have people that we encounter that they're doing just fine in distribution, or they're not doing much in tap room. But I think overall, we are seeing scenarios like this where some portion of the business is underperforming, but it's being hidden because the business is being looked at as a whole, and all the revenue and costs are kind of getting mixed together, and then we're getting a conclusion that isn't reflective of how all the different products we're selling are doing. So now, given this scenario, we can ask ourselves, can we double down on the success of the tap room? And then what the heck is going on in distribution, and what do we need to do to fix it? And so that's kind of like stage 2 of this process. Step 1 is like, let's get the landscape and understand how we're actually doing. And now we can go into pretty granular problem solving mode. And the cool thing about breaking down the cost in this way is that you can do it at the overall business level and split things up. You can also do it at the individual product level. And so you can look at the same things. You can look at revenue, you can look at cost of goods sold, and you can look at general administrative expenses applied to each individual product that we're selling. And so in this example, we're taking a look at the kegs and 12-ounce cases for this brewery's top-selling IPA. And we're going to investigate how we think we're doing across these products based on what the numbers show. So the first thing we're doing is like, okay, we're selling the kegs at $147. We're selling the cases at $28. It's through a distributor, so these prices are relative to that. If we were doing self-distribution, there would be a bit more, hopefully. And so when we add up all the ingredients, this is kind of what we get. Okay, we got more packaging going into the cases. We got some waste in there. It's kind of hard to look at these numbers though, because it's not an apples to apples. So what we have to do here is equalize and get everything in terms of per barrel revenue and per barrel cost. And now we can look across all of our products in the same way and identify how they're performing. And so what we see here is that the kegs are at about $290 per barrel. The case format is at about $386. The costs that go into each are the same. We're producing the beer and then just packaging it differently. And the packaging and waste is kind of where we see the differences. Much more packaging costs going into the cans, labels, waste and everything else. A little bit more with cans, but not too much difference there. Okay, so now we have that. And so we can see like, okay, we're making less in revenue through our kegs, but we also have lower costs. Much more revenue in cans. This is how it works out in terms of gross profit and margins. So typically, gross profit is where we're looking at most of our products and making decisions on what to sell. And here, the picture is not too bad. Like, these margins are not horrible. These are actually pretty good margins. The gross profit for each is pretty similar, even though the cases are able to garner much more revenue. And then on a percentage basis, the margin of the kegs is much higher. And so just looking at those numbers, this is kind of where traditionally we would look at this and be like, let's just sell the hell out of our kegs. Let's sell as much as possible. 63% margin is great. Here's where the problem comes in, is if we now take our G&A expenses from that overall distribution business unit and now divide that up on a barrels basis, we're now getting $440 of cost that needs to be absorbed by that profit. And so 185 is not 440. So we have a big problem. And so what's happening is all of the overhead that we have in order to produce that amount of beer to sell through and generate that amount of revenue, it's actually generating a loss at our current level of sales volume. Now, that G&A per barrel, that will decrease as you increase volume, assuming that you don't increase your costs proportionally. But we want to look at it this way because we're kind of assuming that, you know, if you have a distribution program, like you're putting some effort towards it. You're trying to sell through more. You are building out the capacity in order to sell as much as possible. And so if it were the case that we would look at this and go, oh, we just need to sell more volume in order to make up the difference, you know, that's a challenge. It also, you know, if you haven't been able to do that up until this point, you're going to have to build out a better sales team. You're going to have to figure out how to produce more at higher volumes with the current team and infrastructure that you have. And what we typically see is like, it's never that simple. You're going to have to spend a significant amount in terms of build out in order to really increase volume. And so if this business is limited by the pricing that they can garner through distribution through these two product SKUs, you know, it's going to take a monumental effort for them to make up that $250 difference. And so we have some idea now of where that -30 loss is coming from. And these two products in particular are actually running at an increased loss versus the overall, which means that obviously there are some other products that are actually doing pretty well. And so that can now be another rabbit hole we go down to investigate, okay, if we know these products are not doing well, there's got to be some that are doing well, and maybe we can shift our focus there. Okay, so now some recommendations that can come out of this. We can be really targeted now. We can say, okay, we need to change up our keg strategy. We got to figure out either how to charge more or shift production away or, you know, look at our cost structure. So that's number 2 is like general administrative costs across all products and distribution are clearly an issue. And so now we need to do the deep dive into what's involved in that. We need to look at labor and like, are we overstaffed? We need to look at, okay, is our space too big, or are we in a high rent area that's like really going to hamstring us from being able to make this program work? That's like the next step that the team can investigate and dig into in order to identify how to reverse that loss, or at least make incremental progress towards working out of it. And then, like I said, analyze the other products, understand if there are others that are in worse shape, or actually if there are some that are in better shape, and then maybe we can prioritize our production focus on those. Okay, so now the tap room, we're not going to analyze anything. We're just going to say, how do we do more? And so if there's an area in your business that you identify that seems like it's overperforming, then there's clearly something special about your location, your team, what you're selling through, kind of the overall experience that you're providing that is really making it work. And there's really no reason to assume that you couldn't figure out a way to do more of it. This is especially the case if you're taking focus and resources away from something that's underperforming and then shifting it over here and putting it into the area that's overperforming. What that typically means is like, okay, we're narrowing our focus as a business, but we're putting the focus over here to do more of what's working, and that generally makes everybody pretty happy. So building on the success is really the thing that we would have. This would be our recommendation for this business in terms of how they could improve. Okay. So now comparison, kind of old playbook suggestions. Maybe we could get a canning line to reduce costs, make it more efficient. We could reduce some taproom costs. Maybe we could move into more distribution in order to generate more revenue. Let's find some new investors. We could put some cash in and then kind of figure out how to use it. I think now looking at where this business is at, doing this business unit split, we can see that, okay, getting a canning line would be counterproductive because if we're saying the issue in distribution is like the overall business model is not able to support the revenue we're able to generate, a canning line is probably not a good idea. Reducing taproom costs, like oh, do we really want to cut into the team and the resources we're putting into the thing that's working the best? Probably not. Moving into regional distribution, again, we just covered that. And the alternative is what we said. Let's stop distributing a particular product that's underperforming. Let's focus on the problem area that is causing the issue in terms of overall costs. And then let's double down on what's working. Okay. So that was our exercise. Thank you for staying with me through that math. But really the purpose here is like to illustrate that there may be some things embedded within your businesses that you're not seeing because everything is pooled together. And so it would be a good idea to kind of tease those apart and try to see if that gives you some new insights. And that may be a way of kind of breaking away of this 2015 mindset where it's like, we have good ideas, but we're not sure if they're the right ideas for right now, and shift towards like a very like precision focus, like have the scalpel out in terms of deciding what to do next. And so these are the steps. Run your year-to-date P&L. Everybody was talking about before this. 2023 numbers, get those in, and then start the splitting exercise. Split out revenue, COGS, all the other expenses. Take action. I'm gonna be honest, this is a lot of work. We want to do it for you. We have our team allocated already to do this for you. We've built tools where if you can just get us financials, we will just spit out the answer to the other side. We even took out a full page in the program. This is because we think this is really important, and this is information that we can basically take even messy financials and tease some of this out and get there with like 70-80% accuracy. Anyway, so I encourage you to take advantage of this. If you want to do it yourself, please feel free. I'm available. We're available to advise on that. And that's it. So thank you for listening, and appreciate it. All right, questions?
So I assume you did some kind of pro forma or analysis on all their brands of beer. You showed us IPA, which most of us know is one of the most expensive beers we make, along with like Imperial or Blizzard Stout. Did you find something in their category that they should emphasize in distribution that did have good profitability?
Because this is a hypothetical, we did the minimum amount of work we needed for this presentation. Yeah. So we just looked at IPAs, but generally it is extremely basically like region dependent in terms of what pricing you can command versus cost. Obviously, other product categories cost less to produce. So that's one of the areas we're looking across your product portfolio and analyzing it in that way. It almost always gives you insights that you didn't see before. So I don't have a hard and fast answer on that, other than to say like every brewery has new things to uncover by doing that.
The follow-up to that was, in this scenario, is the production facility separate from the taproom facility, or is it one facility fueling the taproom and distribution?
One facility doing both. So it's kind of like, okay, you have the combined taproom production facility is the main location. Second location is just taproom. And so part of the cost allocation is like, okay, how much of the rent and space and stuff goes towards each. So, yes, sir.
What have you kind of seen, or do you have any like best practices or benchmarks for breweries that are taproom only? That we may not have. We might have business units might be considered the bar for beer and the kitchen.
Yep.
Look at it that way, but in general, what have you seen for breweries?
Yeah, so the other thing that we have been doing is like, okay, within each category, okay, within taproom only, there's like legit taproom only. Then there's like, okay, light food with maybe liquor. Then there's like, okay, we have a food truck, and then there's full kitchen. Like there are a bunch of different categories within that. And within those, we have like different expectations in terms of performance. And so what basically like in those scenarios, what we'll do is look at, okay, how is beer by itself performing? How is kind of the other alcohol program performing? How is food performing coming out of the kitchen, food cogs, all that stuff? And then you can get an idea really across each of your revenue streams, like which one is contributing to the overall whole. And then we get into like a more complicated discussion of like, okay, if we're using food to draw people in order to generate profit from the beer, then you may look at a loss or break even in that category, and it might be like, okay, that's acceptable, that it's doing its job. And honestly, the same thing is true for distribution, where like, if you're using distribution as essentially a marketing channel to feed back into the tap room, that can apply to you. But anyway, that's kind of how we would approach that. Okay.
How are you allocating the overhead? Is that SG&A, was that all barrelage percentage, or was that revenue based?
Yeah, so some of it is barrelage percentage, like production labor makes a lot of sense to do that way. Rent makes sense to do based on square footage, so we'll typically do it based on that. But then it's like, okay, if we use it on a per barrels basis and kind of just go down through all the categories, we're gonna get kind of close. But then if we look at like administrative labor, and if it's primarily somebody who's just the manager of the tap room operations, then it's like, okay, we can just allocate administrative labor to tap room. So we'll go through and customize and make it more granular, but at a global level, that kind of per barrels basis and some of the other allocation methods get it pretty close. So.
Do you have any, so like that example, we started breaking down our business like that last year. And
Great.
We expanded like distribution cans from COVID. Ours are not as skewed, like different, the profits.
Yep.
As those example you presented, but like, do you ever recommend just a way to like unwind that distribution? So that, because obviously it's a revenue generator, but it's losing money, but you can't just quit it tomorrow either.
Yep. What you just said is like, that is the main problem that we are working on with folks right now, which is like, yeah, how do we unwind? Okay, especially if we built out capacity in expectation of future growth. But just like in terms of like team, like if you're facing a situation where the products you're selling aren't working, but then you've built out an awesome production team, then it's like you don't want to just start messing with the mojo, you know. So yeah, it's really what we focused on is like incremental wins. So that's why, you know, if you drill down into individual products, then you can start to make progress one by one. So it's like if we look at IPA kegs or Pilsner cans or whatever, and it's like sell 50% more of this, stop selling this, come up with a really comprehensive set of guidelines for the sales team or whoever's doing sales for you, and then start to use those as constraints to like slowly drive the numbers in the right direction. Because what we want to create the opportunity to potentially downsize the space or sell off equipment or whatever needs to be done. But like you said, if you're in a 5-year lease or whatever, you know, you're not just going to leave your property and go to a different one. If you own the building, you know, even if you wanted to rent it out, like you're going to have to renovate and create a space you can rent out. Like it takes time. So there's got to be like that incremental strategy to start working in the right direction. But then like the big picture goal of like, we are actually heading in the direction of wanting to, you know, essentially right size our operation. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah. I mean, you're taking like one business unit and then breaking it into two, and then breaking those into two, and then breaking those into two.
Yep, especially if you have.
You're analyzing it like a hyper-focused level.
Yeah. So you guys self-distribute or have a distributor?
South Carolina.
Okay. All right, right. So self-distribution is the best scenario there because you have the most control. But if you're working through a distributor, then it's basically like it's tough because we got to like essentially prepare the folks we work with to go into those meetings with the constraints where you essentially like have to be willing to say no to some things, but say yes to others to keep the relationship. So it gets tricky. And that in that particular type of scenario, again, it's like we just have to know where we're heading and then work the incremental strategy to work towards that. And eventually, like, things can get to the point where you have to make some drastic decisions, but there's a lot that you can do up until that point if you have an underperforming part of the business before you get there. So. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day.